For my birthday, my family kept saying, "Just wait. Something big is coming." But it wasn't for me. My name is Roxane Gay. I'm 24. I live in New Orleans and run a small but growing online literary magazine called Literary Bloom. It started as a side project when I was burned out from ghostwriting blog posts for tech executives who couldn't spell sincerity if it hit them in the inbox. Now it's my full-time work. I built it from scratch. No seed money. No mentorship. Just years of deadlines, ignored pitches, and the quiet relief of finally seeing my own name in print. I live alone, by choice, in a small apartment above a vintage bookstore that smells like cedar and ink. My family likes to joke. I live in a tower of books, but they haven't visited in over 6 years. My older brother Lucien, on the other hand, lives in Boston, practices cosmetic dermatology, and is the shining portrait of everything they brag about at dinner parties. He's the kind of sibling who never forgets a holiday, just forgets who raised him. My mother, Madeline, taught high school English for 30 years and still corrects my grammar when she does text me, which is rare. Usually when Lucian's flying in, or when there's some family brunch that requires a feminine touch. Her words, not mine. I used to show up. I used to fly in, bring gifts, and overpack kindness, hoping someone would notice. But eventually, I got tired of hugging people who only looked past me. So when my mom called me out of nowhere, 10 days before my birthday, and asked me what I was doing next Saturday, I thought maybe someone had died. I hadn't heard her voice since Thanksgiving, and even then, it was muffled over the speaker while she told Lucien to be kind to your sister. She means well. But this time, her voice was strangely chipper. She said, "Just keep the day open. Something special is happening. Lucien's in on it. Sophie too. You'll like it." She didn't say the word birthday, but I let myself believe she meant it. It's been so long since anyone planned anything for me that even a vague promise felt like a miracle. 3 days later, I got a group text. It wasn't from my mom. It was from Lucien. It just said, "Clear your calendar next Saturday. Trust me. It's big." No emojis. No explanations. Just the implication that I was being included in something worth canceling things for. That was unusual. Lucien and I hadn't been close in years. We had one of those silent sibling dynamics where we knew too much about each other to fight. So we just stopped sharing. But I still had a photo of us on my desk. Halloween. 1997. I was a witch. He was a doctor. The irony wasn't lost on me. I stared at the message longer than I should have. Then replied, "Okay," and left it at that. I cleared my schedule, moved a Zoom interview with an author I'd been chasing for months, and pushed back a print deadline for our next essay issue. I even canceled a solo dinner I'd planned with myself, which sounds lonely, but isn't. I like choosing my own wine. I like eating without small talk. But this time, I thought maybe I wouldn't have to. The night before, I bought myself a cake, just one layer. Vanilla with lemon cream, in the same flavor my grandmother used to make every June. I wore a dress I hadn't worn since grad school, a soft gray cotton that made me feel like I belonged somewhere gentle. I set the table for 2. I didn't expect someone to show up, but I also didn't want to admit I knew they wouldn't. At 11 a.m., I sat by the window, sipped coffee, and scrolled through old birthday messages from strangers on Twitter. By noon, I started checking Venmo. Like, maybe someone would send me a funny $5. By 2 p.m., I turned off my phone. Not because I was angry, I just didn't want to keep refreshing the absence. At 3 p.m., I checked Instagram. Not to post, but to scroll. And there it was. A boomerang of clinking champagne glasses. A caption that read, "She said, yes, again." The location tag, Gay Family House. Not Boston. Not New Orleans. Lafayette. The house. Our grandmother's house. The one I begged them not to sell. The one Lucien swore was being kept as a backup plan. The one I offered to help renovate last spring, when I had a rare stretch of savings. It was all lit up. Twinkling lights, floral arch. A long table covered in candles and shrimp cocktail. My mother was mid-toast. My Aunt Thea stood beside her, smiling like it was the 82nd again. Sophie, Lucien's fiancée, held up her left hand, now adorned with the exact diamond ring my grandmother once told me I'd get when the time is right. I looked at the date. June 6th, my birthday. The something big had arrived. I just wasn't invited to it. I didn't cry right away. That's something people assume. That heartbreak is loud or instant or soaked in mascara. But it wasn't like that. It was quieter. Like someone had knocked the wind out of the room and left everything standing still, pretending it wasn't missing anything. I stared at the screen. At the boomerangs and perfectly posed group shots. Each one carefully cropped, carefully curated, as if erasing me had been part of the design. I recognized the tablecloth. It was the one my grandmother hand-stitched when she was recovering from surgery in 2098. She used to say that embroidery was just storytelling with thread. I wondered if she'd ever imagined the table it was meant for would become a stage for someone else's beginning. On the very day, she used to call me her June star. I clicked through each photo, not out of curiosity, but confirmation. I needed to know if they had remembered and still chosen this. The cake had "Forever Begins Again" written in cursive gold icing. The floral arrangements were roses and gardenias, my mother's favorites. There was even a musician. Violin. Outdoor string lights curved above the guests like halos. In the corner of one photo, I spotted Aunt Thea holding a wine glass and clapping. She was the one who used to send me handwritten cards on my birthday with pressed petals inside. Last year, she forgot. Said it slipped her mind with everything going on. Now I knew what everything was. Then I saw the necklace. A simple gold pendant. Round. Not flashy. Just worn and smooth. My grandmother wore it every Christmas. Every graduation. Even to Lucien's med school white coat ceremony. When I was 15, she sat beside me on the back porch and let me hold it. She said, "This is for you. When you're grown and the world tries to make you forget you belong, this will remind you that someone saw you before the world tried to unsee you." After she died, I asked my mom if she still had it. She said she'd keep it safe. That was the last I heard of it. Until now. Sophie wore it in every photo. She wore it like a placeholder. Never existed. Like it had always been hers. That was the moment something cracked. Not loud, but final. They hadn't just forgotten. They had rewritten it. The memory, the object, the meaning. They made a new story and cast me out of the old one. It wasn't just that they celebrated without me. It was that they used my day. My grandmother's promise. My place. And they didn't think I'd notice. Or maybe they didn't care if I did. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't ask why. What could I say that wouldn't be folded into some polite dismissal or family excuse? I know how these conversations go. They say it wasn't intentional. They say it was all last minute. They say I'm too sensitive or that I always read too deeply into things. But that's the thing about being invisible for long enough. When people finally see you react, they call it an overreaction. But I wasn't reacting. I was witnessing. And the hardest part of being forgotten isn't the silence. It's realizing the silence was carefully built to keep you quiet. That evening, I didn't eat the cake. I boxed it up, placed it in the fridge, and wrote for later on a sticky note even though I knew there wouldn't be one. I turned my phone screen down, turned off the lights, and sat on the floor of my tiny studio. Around me were early print issues of the magazine, manuscripts with coffee stains, and framed rejection letters I once thought defined me. For a while, I just sat there, breathing in the stillness. Not the kind that asks for answers, Just the kind that makes space for reality to settle in. Lucien texted the next morning. No apology. No explanation. Just a photo of him and Sophie under the string lights. With a caption that read, "Couldn't have asked for a more perfect night." I watched the message fade into the corner of my phone, then disappear behind a push notification about a book review going viral. For a moment, I thought about responding. Something short and surgical. But what was the point? People don't apologize when they don't think they've done anything wrong. And he didn't. They didn't. By noon, my mom left a voicemail. Just her voice. Cheerful. As if she were calling to remind me to water my plants, she said, "Hope you had a lovely weekend. Sweetheart. Let's talk soon." There was no mention of the party, or the ring, or the house I once begged to restore. No mention of the date. No happy birthday. Just the assumption that I'd stay quiet, that I'd smooth things over the way I always did. But something had shifted, and I wasn't sure it would shift back. I deleted the voicemail. Not out of anger, but clarity. This was the story now. Not the one I wish they'd written, but the one they actually did. They had picked their beginning. Now I would pick mine. The week after the party, I didn't answer any calls. I muted the family group chat without a word, archived every thread from Lucien, and removed my mother's ringtone. I didn't block anyone. Blocking feels loud. Like a statement. You want someone to read out loud at dinner. I wasn't looking to start anything. I just didn't want to be interrupted. There's a kind of ache that doesn't scream. It just settles quietly into the background of your thoughts, rewiring the way you check your phone or reread old texts. I wasn't heartbroken. I was clear. And that kind of clarity doesn't come often. But when it does, it rearranges everything. I went back to work. Logged in to edit a first draft about grief and scent memory. Something submitted by a young poet in Oregon who described her mother's perfume as the smell of goodbye. I didn't change much. The piece was already strong. But I stared at the word goodbye longer than necessary. Sometimes, editing someone else's words is the only way I can get close to my own. That week, I rejected 5 new submissions. All of them essays about family reunions. I told myself it was just editorial balance. But I knew I didn't want to read about people finding each other when I was still losing what I never really had. Sam, my friend and colleague, noticed something was off. He didn't pry, just sent me an email with no subject line and 3 words in the body. "If you're breathing, reply." I sent back a single period. He knew what it meant. I was still here. I just not ready to be asked why. We'd worked together for nearly 8 years. Co-founded Literary Bloom over wine and a mutual hatred for marketing emails. He was the only person who ever saw me edit a sentence 3 times. Just for rhythm. He once told me that silence can be either sanctuary or exile. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Lately, I was starting to know the difference too well. On Saturday, a full week after my birthday, I went to the post office. I brought a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a first edition copy of The House of Mirth, one of my grandmother's favorites. I didn't write a note. I didn't include a card. I mailed it to the Lafayette address. Attention to Sophie Green. No return name. I wasn't trying to reclaim anything. I just wanted one piece of that house to remember. I had once been there. A reminder that I wasn't erased, just removed. Sometimes, letting go is not about forgiveness. It's about taking your name back from the mouths that never learned how to hold it properly. That afternoon, I cleared the bookshelf in my studio. I removed the family photos one by one, wrapped them in paper, and stacked them in a drawer. I kept only one, my grandmother and me on her porch, legs crossed, hands resting between us like a language. Only we spoke. The necklace was around her neck. I looked young. I hadn't learned yet what some people mean when they say love. I framed that photo in white and placed it near the window. She's the only one who ever saw me before I learned to apologize for existing. Lucien called on Sunday. I watched it ring twice, then fade into missed call. 30 minutes later, a text came through. You left the group. Everything okay? I read it 3 times. It was the kind of message you send when you already know the answer, but hope the other person will lie and say they're fine. I didn't reply. 2 hours later, another one arrived. Look, I get that you're upset, but it wasn't intentional. Sophie didn't know. Mom didn't mean it that way. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. I've learned that when someone says they didn't mean to hurt you, they're just trying to skip the part where they listen. I went for a walk after that. The air was heavy with southern summer, damp and buzzing with insects. I stopped at a small gallery that had just opened downtown. Inside was a photography exhibit called Things Left Unsaid. One of the photos showed an empty dinner table with 9 chairs. Only one with a plate set. I stared at it for longer than I meant to. The caption read, "Absence isn't always an accident." I nodded. The girl at the desk asked if I wanted to sign the guest book. I wrote my name, and then underneath, a single sentence. Still here, just not seated. That night, I opened the draft folder of a new column series I'd been avoiding for months. It was called Last Names. I wasn't sure what it would become, just that it would start with one question. What does it mean when the people who gave you your name no longer say it? And what do you do when you finally stop waiting for them to remember? By Monday morning, I had made a decision I didn't announce. I booked a solo retreat space in Asheville for 3 nights. It wasn't a big deal. Just a converted greenhouse, turned writing cabin with no Wi-Fi and a rainwater shower. I didn't go to disappear. I went to hear myself think without the static of who I used to be around my family. There's something about being alone in the mountains that strips your name back to its essentials. I packed light, brought only a notebook, a scarf my grandmother knit before arthritis took her hands, and the most worn-out draft of the last names concept I had printed months ago, but never dared open. On the train up, I didn't scroll. I stared out the window and counted pine trees like they were old regrets I finally had time to name. When I arrived, the caretaker gave me a tour, handed me a real key instead of a passcode, and said, "Let the woods do the heavy lifting." I nodded. Not because I believed her, but because I wanted to. That first night, I didn't write a word. I sat with a cup of mint tea, legs tucked under a patchwork quilt, and watched the sky go from lavender to black. I replayed every text that had arrived since my birthday, and every one that hadn't. I remembered the way Sophie's hand held the necklace like it never belonged anywhere else. I thought of Lucian's silence after the ring photo. I let myself grieve it without justifying anyone's intentions. I didn't try to figure out who meant well or who forgot on purpose. I just accepted that meaning well and doing harm can exist in the same breath, and most people are too fragile to admit they confuse the two. By sunrise, something had shifted. Not forgiveness, not peace, but clarity sharp enough to slice through habit. I took out the print draft and made notes in red pen. I circled a sentence that said, "What if family isn't about who remembers you, but about who refuses to forget?" I rewrote it. Family might begin with blood, but it survives through naming. I didn't mean surnames. I meant the act of naming pain, naming presence, naming what was taken without consent. I worked on it for hours, not like I was building a published piece, but like I was reconstructing a foundation that had rotted from silence. On the second day, I took a hike up a muddy trail behind the cabin. At the summit, there was an overlook, with one wooden bench carved with the words, "I was here." I sat on it longer than I planned, staring at the mist as it climbed through trees, like it didn't care about being witnessed. That's how I wanted to move now. Not to be seen, not to make a point, but to be undeniable without asking for acknowledgement. When I returned to the cabin, I drafted an editorial letter for the fall issue of Literary Bloom. It wasn't about what happened. It didn't name anyone. but it spoke directly to every reader who had ever felt replaced by someone easier to love. I ended the note with a line I hadn't planned. You are not too much. You are just too true for those who prefer the shadow version of love. The morning I left, I folded the scarf neatly and left it on the windowsill. I left a thank you note for the caretaker and included a book of poetry from our archives. I didn't want to take everything back with me. Some things I had finally earned the right to set down. On the train home, I passed through Baton Rouge just as the sun was rising. It painted the tracks gold and made every reflection in the window feel like a version of myself I no longer needed to be. Back in New Orleans, I opened my inbox to a message from a podcast producer I'd never met. She'd read a short essay I'd published under a pen name 6 months ago, the one about inheriting silence. She asked if I wanted to talk about it on air. No names needed. I said yes before I could think of all the reasons not to. The next day, I recorded from my studio closet. I didn't prepare. I didn't edit. I told the story the way it happened. A birthday. A necklace. A table that wasn't mine. A silence that wasn't shared. And how sometimes the only way to heal from being left out is to stop knocking on the door entirely. When the episode went live a week later, I didn't expect anything, but the emails came in. Not from my family, from strangers. Women in their 30s, 40s, 70s. Men who hadn't spoken to their brothers in years. People who had been written out of wills, or weddings, or family lore, but still remembered everything. They didn't want revenge. They just wanted to feel like not being chosen didn't mean they didn't count. And somehow, hearing my voice made them feel less alone. That was when I knew I hadn't just survived what happened. I had named it. And once you name something, you can never unknow its shape. 2 weeks after the podcast aired, I received a package at the Literary Bloom office. There was no return address, just a brown envelope with handwriting. I recognized immediately. It was my mother's. I held it for a while, before opening, fingers hesitating at the seal, like opening it might re-release everything I had just learned to contain. Inside was a greeting card with an image of magnolias in bloom. The front read, "Thinking of you," which felt both vague and too late. Inside, a single line was written, "It's been busy. I hope you're well. Love, Mom." Tucked into the card was a small pressed flower, something she hadn't sent me since my 20s. I didn't feel warmth. I felt confirmation that even now, when she tried, she still chose gesture over truth. That weekend, I went back to the house I grew up in, not physically, just in memory. I wrote a new piece for the column. This time, about the difference between being remembered and being restored. I recalled the days I spent in the attic, sorting through old family boxes. The way my mother would call up from downstairs, telling me not to mess up her system. There was no system, just boxes full of old photographs and unspoken rules. I remember finding a photo of Lucien as a toddler, covered in cake. The back read Lucien. Second birthday. Our light. I found no similar label on mine. I remember how that stung more than I admitted then. Not because I wanted to be someone's light, but because I hadn't realized how long I had been sitting in their shadow. Lucien texted again on a Wednesday afternoon. "I heard your voice on something. Is that your show?" It wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't curious either. It was the kind of text you send when you know the answer and hope it isn't what you think. I didn't answer. That Saturday, Sophie followed the Literary Bloom Instagram account, then unfollowed a day later. I saw it in the notifications. That brief flicker of interest, followed by the quick retreat of someone who maybe realized they didn't want to see what they'd tried to replace. I didn't take it personally. She was just living the story they gave her. She didn't take anything from me. They offered it. A few days later, I was invited to a community roundtable on identity, writing, and invisible grief. It was a small panel, mostly local authors and editors. Nothing press-worthy. But it was held at the university I had dropped out of during my junior year. The same school where Lucien gave his alumni speech last spring. The same one where I once published a poem that made my grandmother cry. And not the happy kind. I accepted the invitation. Not for revenge. For re-entry. I wanted to speak in a place that once told me I wasn't quite what they needed. The panel was intimate. 20 people. Mostly students. They asked thoughtful questions. Not about how to get published or how to grow an audience, but about how to stay whole when your name gets erased from the version of history everyone else remembers. I didn't give them steps. I gave them stories. About the locket. About the birthday. About being told you were part of something, only to realize you were the placeholder until someone easier came along. At the end, a girl raised her hand. She couldn't have been older than 19. She said, "How did you not get bitter?" I didn't answer right away. Then I told her what I knew to be true. Bitterness is just grief that never got a witness. I chose to become my own. That night, I walked past a bakery near the square. In the window was a lemon cream cake with tiny sugared violets. For a moment, I thought of buying it, but I didn't need it to prove anything anymore. I walked home instead, made a cup of tea, and read through the final draft of the next issue. The theme was resonance. Every piece we selected spoke to something I hadn't been able to say out loud until now. I didn't include an editor's note. Sometimes silence doesn't mean erasure. Sometimes, it means you finally stopped explaining your presence to people who only see you when they need contrast. Later that week, a letter arrived at my studio. This time from Lucien. Handwritten. That surprised me. Inside, 3 pages. Carefully folded. He said things like, "I didn't realize what we were doing until it was too late, and Mom's not good at repair." He asked if we could talk. No demands. No assumptions. Just a line near the end that said, "You don't owe me a reply, but I'm here, if you ever want to change the story." I reread that line 3 times. Not because I forgave him, but because I believed him. Not about changing the story. About knowing he could no longer pretend it hadn't happened. I didn't write back. Maybe not ever. But I left the letter on my desk. Unshredded. Unopened. After that first read. Not every closure needs to slam. Some just need to stay ajar. Not so. Someone can come in. But so you remember. You were never the one who closed it. The first official review of Last Names came out the following week. It was a short piece in a niche literary blog, tucked between a debut poetry collection and an interview with a memoirist who had written about estranged siblings. But the reviewer got it. She called the series a quiet reckoning with the language of belonging, and that phrase stayed with me longer than I expected. Quiet reckoning. That was exactly what I had been building. Sentence by sentence. Version by version. Not a takedown. Not a revenge arc. Just a place where absence didn't go unspoken. Where stories that had been flattened for the comfort of others could finally breathe with their real shape. That same afternoon, I was invited to speak at a regional writers' conference in Austin. The theme was Narratives That Heal, and I accepted without hesitation. Not because I felt fully healed, but because I knew what it meant to hold a microphone when you once weren't even offered a seat. On stage, I didn't talk about the necklace. I didn't talk about Lucien. I talked about legacy. About how the stories we inherit often come with edits we never agreed to. I spoke about the difference between being remembered and being preserved. How some families don't forget you. They revise you. And how the only way to undo that edit is to write yourself back in. On your terms. In your language. After my session, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes and said, "That was the first time I didn't feel ashamed for not calling my mother back." I didn't give her advice. I just held her hand for a moment and said, "Sometimes, silence is the only boundary they'll listen to." It wasn't a mantra. It was just the truth. Later that night, I walked back to my hotel room, opened the balcony door, and let the noise of the city fill the space where family used to live in me. Not out of bitterness, out of permission. My own. Meanwhile, Lucien sent one more letter. This time, a photo tucked inside. It was the house in Lafayette. The front porch had been repainted, the garden replanted. On the back, he wrote one sentence. She would have liked it better with you in it. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The sentence wasn't meant to be answered. It was an apology disguised as a memory. Or maybe a memory that had finally remembered where it started. I placed it in a drawer beside my grandmother's scarf. Not as keepsake, as record. A month passed. Sophie got married in a quiet ceremony. Not the public spectacle I had once imagined she would plan. I wasn't invited, but I saw the photos online. My mother wore a navy dress. Lucien looked smaller somehow. And Sophie smiled, like she had no idea she'd walked into the center of a wound that wasn't hers. She wore the necklace. Of course she did. I didn't feel rage when I saw it. I felt something else. Like watching someone hold a language they didn't speak, reciting a script without knowing the history. I closed the tab and moved on with my day. By then, Literary Bloom had tripled its subscribers. Last Names was being taught in 2 college courses and had been featured in a national newsletter on identity and storytelling. I didn't post about it. I didn't send updates to my family. I let the work stand on its own. Not as proof, but as presence. There's a difference between success and visibility. One can be granted, the other you reclaim. On the day of the wedding, I hosted a writing salon in New Orleans. 8 women showed up. None of them knew each other. By the end of the night, they were passing around drafts like secrets. One of them read a line I'll never forget. My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. We all exhaled at the same time. That kind of line rewrites a room. Later that night, I walked home through the French Quarter. The lights soft and the air thick with jasmine. I passed by a store window displaying antique lockets. One of them looked almost identical to the one Sophie now wore. I didn't go in. I didn't need a replica. I already had the memory. The real one. The porch. My grandmother's voice. The way her hand pressed the locket into my palm, like it meant something more than metal. That moment belonged to me. No wedding photo could overwrite it. No caption could revise it. When I got home, I opened the next draft of the column and began with a line that surprised even me. There are stories you don't need to correct. Just outgrow. I wrote until my eyes blurred. Not out of sadness. Out of stillness. The kind that doesn't need a reply. The kind that finally fits. It had been almost 3 months since the birthday. I spent waiting for a family that never intended to include me. In that time, I hadn't spoken to my mother. I hadn't replied to Lucien's letter. And hadn't checked the family group chat, even though I knew they'd probably added me back without asking. What I had done was very different. I had spoken on panels, held private workshops, said yes to 2 interviews, and helped an emerging writer publish her first piece about being the only adopted child in a family that praised biological resemblance, like it was a sport. She told me, after we published it, that she'd printed the piece and taped it to her fridge. "It's not for them," she said. "It's for me, to remember that it happened, even if they never admit it." That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. That weekend, I opened a box I hadn't touched in years. It was one I kept in the back of the hallway closet, under old coats and a broken lamp I never threw out. Inside were things I used to believe were neutral. A childhood drawing of our old house with 4 windows and 2 smiling stick figures. A birthday card Lucien once made in crayon. A faded sweatshirt from my first college that I only wore during thunderstorms. And a notebook, spiral-bound, edges curled from time. It was my grandmother's journal. Not a diary. She never called it that. She said diaries were for secrets and journals were for sense-making. I opened it carefully. The way you hold something alive. Most of the entries were short. Lists of things to buy. Quotes from poems. Recipes scribbled in between reflections about the weather. But near the end, dated 1 week before her final hospital stay, was a line that made me pause. Roxane sees things, the rest of them miss. Not because she's trying, because she listens longer than most can bear. I stared at that line until the words blurred. Then I wrote it down on a post-it and stuck it to my desk. Not for inspiration, for confirmation. She saw me, fully, not out of obligation, but out of clarity. And even though she was gone, the truth she wrote was still intact. That kind of recognition outlives the people who forgot your name. Later that evening, I went back through my old essays. Some were stiff, some still held. I opened the draft folder for a piece I'd once tried to write about the concept of erasure, but never finished. It had started as an exploration of archival loss and ended up sounding too abstract. This time, I rewrote the introduction completely. Some absences are not accidents. They are orchestrations disguised as oversight. And surviving them doesn't mean being remembered. It means remembering yourself out loud. I didn't workshop that line. I didn't polish it. I left it raw, exactly as it had arrived. The next morning, I submitted that essay to a digital anthology on generational silence. The editor responded within 3 hours, asking if I'd like to record the audio version myself. She said, my written voice had weight, but she felt the spoken one might carry more. I said yes, not because I needed the exposure, but because I was tired of only being read. I wanted to be heard, not just by strangers, but by the version of me that had once whispered, maybe if I'm quiet enough, they'll finally notice. That girl deserved to hear herself in full volume. I recorded the piece in one take. No edits, no music bed, just breath between paragraphs. When I finished, I didn't replay it. I didn't need to hear it again. Saying it once, clearly, and without apology, was enough. That night, I slept through without waking. No dreams about family tables or missing invitations. Just quiet. The kind that doesn't need explanation. The kind that lets your body know it is no longer bracing for impact. A few days later, I received a message request on social media. It was from a former classmate, someone I barely remembered. She wrote, I saw your piece. I didn't know how much I needed to read that until I did. She didn't mention family. She didn't ask questions. She just said, thank you for making something that didn't try to fix anything, just made space for it to exist. I replied simply, that's all I ever wanted. And it was true. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to be celebrated. I just wanted a place where the story didn't have to hide behind someone else's comfort. And for the first time, I realized I'd built it. Not all at once, not without pain, but sentence by sentence, step by step, until it stood without needing permission. It was mid-November when the first real attempt at reconciliation arrived. Not in the form of a conversation, but as an invitation. A thick cream-colored envelope with gold calligraphy, postmarked from Boston. Inside was a save-the-date card for Lucien and Sophie's postponed public wedding celebration, scheduled for April, at the Lafayette House. The same house they'd used to replace my birthday. The same porch where I once helped my grandmother peel peaches for cobbler and where she first taught me how to listen to silence. The card was elaborate, full of pastel swirls and forced joy. At the bottom, in small italic print, it read, family is the beginning of everything. I didn't flinch. I didn't feel warmth or bitterness. I felt distance. Not cold. Not cruel. Just measured. Like when you stop trying to fit into a story that was never written with your voice in mind. A week later, my mother called. This time, I picked up, mostly out of curiosity. Her voice was cheerful but hesitant. like someone trying to build a bridge with matchsticks. She said they hoped I'd come, that Lucien had asked for it specifically, that it would mean a lot to the family. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then she added, "You know, sweetheart, no matter what's happened, we're still family. That has to count for something." I let the silence stretch for a moment, not to punish, but to clarify. Then I said the only thing I had been certain of for months. "I used to be there. Mom. You just didn't look at me." The line stayed quiet. Not dropped. Just hollow. Then she said, "That's not true, honey." But it was. And I think deep down, she knew it too. The call ended with a soft "let me know." Like she was trying to sound casual. As if my presence were a logistical detail, not the echo of everything they'd refused to acknowledge. I didn't respond that night. Instead, I made a small change in my studio. I took down the last family photo I had hanging. It was from a Christmas years ago. Before Sophie. Before the edits. Before I learned that being included doesn't always mean being seen. I replaced it with a print I'd been saving. A black and white photograph of a table with one empty chair. Captioned in, "Faint type absence is a kind of presence too." In the days that followed, messages trickled in. Aunt Thea sent me a forwarded recipe and then, in a second message, a short apology. I should have said something. I didn't know how. I didn't reply. But I didn't delete it either. Lucien texted again. This time, a photo of the locket resting on a folded napkin, as if it could speak for him. No words. Just the image. I stared at it for a while. Not because I missed it, but because I realized I didn't. The necklace no longer held weight. It had been emptied of meaning, the moment they gave it away, without remembering who it was promised to. I wasn't angry. I just didn't want it back. Around the same time, an editor at a major literary magazine reached out. She wanted to feature last names in a winter issue focused on legacy and repair. She asked if I could expand the concept into a full essay, not just about family, but about what it means to no longer seek return. I agreed. Not for them. For the version of me that once thought silence was survival. I titled the essay, "Inheritance Without Permission." I wrote it in 3 days. The final paragraph came to me just before sleep one night. Some stories end, not with closure, but with refusal. Not to forget, but to keep remembering without asking anyone else to agree. It happened. That's the shape of healing. Not a neat circle, but a door you leave open, not so they can come back, but so you know you didn't have to lock it to be free. I didn't send that quote to Lucien. I didn't forward the article to my mother. I let it exist on its own terms. Like I finally could. When the RSVP deadline for the wedding came, I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Silence is a response too, especially when it's no longer waiting for permission to count. The day of the wedding came and went without a ripple in my calendar. I didn't check the time. I didn't scroll to see updates. And didn't wonder what song they danced to. I went to the farmer's market that morning, picked up a bundle of lavender, then stopped at the local art supply store to restock ink. In the afternoon, I hosted a writing session with 2 mentees who were struggling with the same thing I used to believing. Your story deserves the page even if no one claps. One of them asked if I'd ever written about my own family. I smiled and told her the truth, only when I stopped needing them to read it. It wasn't a dig. It was liberation. That evening, I lit a candle, not to honor anyone, just to mark a quiet return to myself. I wrote in my journal, something I rarely do anymore. I wrote, "Today, they gave each other promises. And today, I didn't need one." That line felt heavy in my hand. Not because it hurt, but because it no longer did. I had already grieved what wasn't mine. I had already buried the hope that they'd ever look back and say, "We should have done that differently." That part of the story was over. Not resolved with a bow, but concluded with a decision. I would not spend the rest of my life explaining why being excluded mattered. I would build a life where inclusion was no longer the prize. The next morning, a package arrived. It was from a reader, someone I'd never met, but who had followed last names since its first post. Inside was a letter and a framed quote she'd painted by hand. The quote was mine, though I had forgotten writing it. "I am not hard to love. I am just hard to fool." That hit something I hadn't named yet. For so long, I had bent myself into whatever shape made people comfortable, mistaking tolerance for love and attention for care. But lately, I had stopped contorting. I had stayed still. And the people who didn't know what to do with stillness had quietly left. The ones who stayed saw me clearly. Later that week, a podcast producer reached out again. She wanted me back on, this time for a live recording with audience questions. I hesitated. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew live meant real. No edits. No protective distance. But I said yes. Because if the point of everything I'd lived through was to name the silence, then I couldn't keep avoiding the echo. The night of the event, I wore a deep green linen dress. One my grandmother would have complimented in the quiet way she always did, with a look and a nod instead of words. The moderator opened with a line I hadn't expected. She said, "Your story made a lot of people feel less invisible. But I wonder, do you still feel seen?" I paused. Then I said, "Sometimes. But more importantly, I see myself. And that has to be enough. It has to start there." The audience stayed quiet, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. Then someone asked, "What would you say to the version of yourself still waiting for the invite? Still staring at the second plate at the table?" I didn't think. I just answered. I'd tell her that she was never waiting for an invite. She was waiting for permission. And she already had it. The moment she stopped asking. After the recording, a young man approached me, eyes rimmed with red. He said, "My sister and I haven't spoken in 6 years. She thinks I forgot her birthday. But I was too ashamed to show up with nothing to give." I nodded and said, "Then show up now. Not with flowers. With truth." He hugged me, which I didn't expect, and then left quickly, as if afraid to linger in the moment. I understood that feeling too well. Sometimes healing comes disguised as leaving before you get hurt again. That night, I walked home alone. The sky was navy and calm. No fireworks. No metaphors. Just air and streetlights. I passed the old corner cafe where I used to wait for calls that never came. I didn't stop. I didn't look inside. I just kept walking. Not away from anything, but toward a version of myself that no longer needed to be referenced to exist. A version that didn't sit quietly, hoping someone would ask how she's doing. A version that had learned how to write her own presence into the room. And in that quiet walk, that long exhale of a day, I realized something I hadn't been able to say before. I didn't get revenge. I just chose to continue. And sometimes, that's the loudest thing you can do. I used to think closure came with confrontation, like the movies said it would. That, if I just said the perfect thing at the perfect moment, people would finally see what they did and feel sorry for it. But life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. Sometimes the apology never comes. Sometimes the people who erased you move on without noticing the space they left behind. And sometimes, you realize the real power isn't in being seen by them, it's in no longer needing to be. The week after the podcast, I got a message from my father. It wasn't long, just a photo of a flower arrangement and a text that read, "Your mom would have liked this." No context, no mention of the wedding, or of me not being there. Just a random offering, too late and too vague to hold weight. I didn't reply, not out of anger, but because I no longer believed I owed anyone a response just to keep the peace they never extended to me. That, in itself, was peace. That weekend, I took a short trip to the coast. I stayed in a rented cabin facing the ocean. with no internet and no schedule. I brought 3 books and left my phone off the entire time. The quiet was so deep, it felt like I could finally hear my own thoughts without interruption. I remembered a quote I had written years ago in a notebook I thought I'd lost. Some people are chapters. Some are footnotes. You get to decide who makes it into the next edition. I sat with that for a while. Not everyone deserves to be part of your story, just. By the third morning, I realized I wasn't thinking about them anymore. Not about who said what, or who didn't show up, or how I used to play it all back in my head on repeat. Like I was trying to edit the past into something kinder. I just wasn't carrying it. And that absence, that emotional, quiet, felt like the truest form of justice. Not dramatic, not loud, just mine. I came home with a new idea for a short series. Not about revenge. Not about proving anyone wrong. But about people who quietly rebuild when no one's watching. People who stop waiting to be invited to the table and start building one of their own. I started writing the first script that night. And for the first time in a long while, it flowed without friction. Because it wasn't about pain anymore. It was about clarity. A few days later, my assistant forwarded me a message from a production company that had passed on my work 2 years ago. Now, they wanted a meeting. They said they'd been watching my growth. I said yes. But not out of validation. I said yes because the work was good. And I was ready. The difference this time, I wasn't writing to prove I belonged. I was writing because I already knew I did. I still walk by the same cafes. Still see the occasional tagged photo that lets me know who's still pretending. But it doesn't sting. It barely registers. Because when you truly choose yourself, not in defiance, but in peace, the noise dims. You stop needing people to remember you correctly. You start remembering yourself fully. And maybe that's the quiet ending no one talks about. Not the grand confrontation. Not the sudden apology. Just a life that no longer depends on their understanding. A life where the absence of their support no longer feels like a tragedy, but like an open space where something true can finally grow. So no, I didn't get revenge. I didn't burn bridges or expose anyone or give a speech that made the whole room gasp. I just kept going. I kept creating. I kept becoming someone I actually respected. And somewhere along the way, the weight I used to carry got lighter. Then softer. And then, finally, it was gone. Maybe you've been there too. Waiting for the call that never comes. Hoping for the invite that gets lost in silence. Wondering if you're the only one who notices the absence. You're not. And even if they never say it, you still get to choose what happens next. Because sometimes, the real victory isn't making them regret losing you. It's realizing you were never lost to begin with. And have you ever quietly moved on from the people who never showed up for you? Or are you still holding space for them in a story that's ready to turn the page?